last panel. This is the panel that's focusing on the food industry, and it was organized very kindly by Ted Banks. Our sort of professionals panel consists of Ted, who is a partner at the law firm in Chicago of Scharf, Banks, and Marmor. He's also an adjunct professor at Loyola Law School. He will be joined by Christine Palumbo, who's senior counsel at Mondelez Food, and Marcia Glenn, who's the former senior vice president of procurement at Kraft. Our academic panelists are Emilie Aguirre, who is currently the Dickerson Fellow at the University of Chicago, and who, as I understand it, will be joining the faculty of Duke Law School in the coming year. Tim Cummins, who needs absolutely no introduction to this group. He's president of WCC and a professor at the University of Leeds. We also have Bob Gibbons, whose reputation I'm sure precedes him. He is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management at MIT. Also with us is Emilie Kadens, a well-known legal historian who's a professor of law at Northwestern. And my colleague, Douglas Baird, the Harry Bigelow Distinguished Service Professor at the law school and former dean of the law faculty. Douglas also has the distinction of being a chef. So with that, I will turn things over to Ted and to any of our other panelists who want to have any reflections or remarks based on what they saw here today. I know some of you have been here for quite some time. I'll take questions the old-fashioned way through people raising their hand, and people who signed on through the WCC link can ask questions via the chat. So I will turn it over to you now, Ted, and thank you very much for taking the time to put together such an interesting group of people.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And thanks to everyone else here. This is a very intimidating group of panelists, and I look forward to learning from you as I have from the previous speakers. Now, I have to admit that my view as a lawyer who is in the trenches for 45 years now, fighting about contracts, is somewhat jaundiced. And frankly, I was unaware of the academic work of Lisa, Brad, Kate, Oliver, and others in this area, and I wish I had read all of that many, many years ago when I was trying to figure out why we were having problems with contracts. I also didn't know that in 1963, Oliver Macaulay talked about putting a contract in a drawer as a sign of success. I was saying that all the time. If you're able to put your contract away and not refer to it, then you've got a good relationship. And I didn't realize the significance of the word relationship then. But I would sum things up as the problems I saw in contracting, starting from literally my second day on the job when I was handed 30 contract problems, was due to a couple of things. One is a mismatch of expectations caused by failure to communicate and a failure to contemplate changed circumstances. And what I've also seen is that there is a huge issue that exists between a mismatch of power when it comes to contracting. The discussions today have really talked about multi-billion-dollar companies talking to multi-billion-dollar companies. And there you have more of an equality of bargaining, and you can do stuff. Now, I no longer work for a multi-billion-dollar company, and I work for some food startups. And they're pretty much given a take-it-or-leave-it contract. And the fact that any food startup succeeds at all, particularly when they rely on outside manufacturing, is a wonder to me, because they are literally victimized by these other companies who don't really care whether they survive or not. And you can do all that you want about trying to convince them what your interests are and all the things you talk about. It doesn't matter. So I guess I would say if there are any rules that I discern about contracting, I derive from other areas of the law. The first one I would take from money laundering law, and it's KYC, know your customer. There has to be an understanding of who's on the other side of your contract. And if you don't do that due diligence, you could have problems. And sort of from my problems when we first tried to do business with companies in China, and there was a lot of fraud and other things that made it difficult, notwithstanding what they promised us, which turned out to be untrue. The other area of law that I would analogize to is in corporate compliance, where the insistence is having a good corporate culture. And that's really what you want to know when you're talking to your other party. What is their culture? Without a match on that area, you'll never get to a relationship that is going to be successful, because they literally won't be able to be trusted to articulate mutual interests that they'll stick to. So we'll talk about all those things later on, but I think I'll turn it over to Marcia to see if she has any comments.
Where's that mute button? Well, it has been a very, very interesting afternoon and evening to hear all the discussions of the contracts and language contract world across the world. And I guess my little add to it before we kind of open it up to maybe some broader questions, there was many things in response to the discussions today I think we could talk further about. But, you know, everyone I think knows Kraft Foods pretty well. It's a very global company, but it's a very local company. So we heard a lot of discussions about certainly size and scale and scope with big global companies. Well, Kraft Foods certainly had that in many capacities. But also we were very local and very regional in many parts of the world. So I think one of the things in my learning was to be able to take what we were trying to do from a national North American standpoint and apply that more broadly across the world. It proved to be quite difficult. So some of the things we were doing in supplier relationship management really in the late 2000, early 2000 period did not necessarily work in other parts of the world, as well as we were trying to make it operate in the US. Again, as we've talked about in many instances, Kraft had the capability to leverage its scale in many, many places, and much of what we were able to do was put forward a take it or leave it contract, and that had been our tradition. As we started to move away from those kinds of things, our history and culture of doing that came into play, and we had to really help the world understand how things were evolving a little bit differently. I think one of the things that made me think about listening to the BPO conversation in the last panel is very much related to a big company structure that we've talked about, big matrix organization, where functions and business units interplay to decide how the relationship with the supplier is going to operate. Well, that also exists within the company. What function is going to lead the relationship with the supplier? What role does procurement play? What role does legal play? What role does R&D play across the supply base? If you're doing a big PPO outsourcing, what role does IT play? What role obviously does HR if that's part of what you're outsourcing? When you look at the time period of contracts, it is the leading up obviously to the contract, the setting of the expectations or metrics, but it's also through the life of the contract, which we also heard about. Kraft typically would have 3 to 5 year contracts, not the extended ones we heard with Boeing and Rolls-Royce and some of those ones. So we tend to have shorter ones. And then after the fact, how does that, when you're rebidding that contract and rebidding and evaluating that performance and rebidding it? Many of the BPO kinds of exercises which we undertook were really designed, of course, to clean up your own organization. You can do it internally. You could convert fixed costs to variable costs. And by trying to clean up and structure that for an outsourced contract, you actually got your hand around what you were doing internally. That was very difficult internally, even before you start the process to try to transfer that to somebody else. So those kinds of things are relate to the relationship, not only with the supplier, but how you're setting up your own internal organization to interface with that across the different functional areas. And it's quite different. So one of the things was who's leads, who's consulting, you know, who's got the final decision, which we've heard about throughout the day. Where does that final decision get to be made? And so I think those are things that companies, you know, sort through internally, but also externally with their supplier over the life of the contract. And that's been touched on a little bit today. One of the other things I wanted to, I saw it in some of the chat conversation, I think it'd be good to kind of open up more broadly, is the trust but verify conversation that people have. It's certainly, I would ask the question is, does it really create trust? And I think many people through IT businesses and other business, the notion of how you ran that relationship was trust but verify. And I think that does tend to damage the relationship. So what are your metrics? What are your what is the transparency? But we heard from the very beginning speaker this morning, trust is trust. And if you got to check it, maybe it's not quite the trust you think. So how do you create that kind of a situation? So that was one. The other thing I wanted to share also, we've had some conversation today about make buy, vertical integration. What's the role that plays in an organization? And obviously for a company like Kraft, very, very critical. And in my experience, you know, when you've been doing something, if you've been making cheese or if you've been running your HR department, and then you go to outsource that, you really know how to do that. But 10 years later, you may have lost that expertise internally in the organization. So you really don't know how to do it anymore. You may have a thought about it, but it's not nearly the same as when you were doing it yourself and you're just in the business of doing that. I mean, one of the things I think certainly companies that have the scale and capability to do it, you know, can get in and out of vertical integration to make sure they understand key capabilities that are critical and strategic for their own business. Because once it's out, it's hard to bring back in. So I think those are kind of conversations that we would often have when we went to outsource a big piece of our business to an external manufacturer or a business process. So anyway, those are a couple of things that I would share. I've got some more notes, but let's turn it over to Christine and to the panel.
Sure. Yeah. And everyone, I'm actually the lawyer at a multi-billion-dollar company right now, you know, living the life of supporting some of our procurement folks and some of their mostly like ingredient contracts and otherwise. And I think a couple of things that, you know, observations that I wanted to share with the group today as I work, you know, and support that function is, you know, what I've seen over the years. And Mondelez, just for context, if you're not familiar with the company, actually is a company that's split from Kraft. So, you know, we have today the snack business that Kraft previously had. So we have, with that split, taken over a lot of the practices that I think Marcia actually, you know, had her hand in and helped to create, where things like, you know, the plain language contracts, and have actually even expanded upon that today with a lot of processes. And I just want to build on Marcia's comment. You know, today our procurement function, you know, is organized in a way, it is global, we're a global company, but you know, where we have certain folks who are supposed to specialize in certain areas, right? So you have your folks who are more, we do still, you know, purchase in the dairy industry. You have your folks who are more in the IS or, you know, information data segment area. So we're building the internal expertise to help you know, move forward these contracts. But one observation that, you know, I've found and of working with my procurement colleagues is there's a lot of process, right? And there's a lot of templates, and these templates are those which, you know, are ones which are favorable to our company as a multi-billion-dollar company. And reading some of the articles and, you know, on relational contracts, and, you know, we have those term for convenience clauses in 30 days for our company, right? And I can tell you some of the commentary I've, you know, had over the years and things that I've helped negotiate is, you know, that is not looked on, you know, as, you know, favorable for many of our suppliers. You know, that and the limitation of liabilities clause are two of the main clauses that are heavily negotiated and almost the sticking points on on each side, especially in the ingredient side of our business. So, just thinking about, just hearing about some of these theories and thinking about them, actually, I see how they play in a day-to-day. I mean, one, just as an example to give some color into how these things happen, I was speaking to a procurement gentleman who does work in our sugar and dairy, procures those ingredients for us. And he said, oftentimes we RFP and we have a 40-page contract that we send out, and we expect we say we expect everyone to sign as is. We get folks giving us 3-page, the max 7-page contracts, and then it ends up being a 6 to 9, process of negotiating. So it's an interesting thing to think through, what is the best approach, but just wanted to give you some of those inside type of commentary.
Thank you, Christine. I think we will go first to Emilie Aguirre for some commentary and raising of some buckets of questions.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for being here. So we've heard a lot of themes today, and I'm particularly excited to jump into them with all of you. But some of the themes I think that are guiding our conversation today have to do with topics that have come up in other of the panels. And so those include things like quality, contracts and quality. Ensuring quality is critical. And what that means varies not just by sector, but by product, and in food, by commodity in the food. And so some of the broad motivating questions here: what is quality in this context? And how are contracts used or not to ensure supplier quality? Another theme is contracts and reputations. We've been hearing all about how reputation and relationships are key. And we may tend to think of reputation as being only or primarily consumer facing, but it might extend to other parties too. And so how do reputation among suppliers and even employees or investors drive contracting with suppliers? And then lastly, contracts and innovation. So there's a ton of innovation in food, in the products that are being made, in how we grow the commodities that are going into those products, in the packaging, in the sourcing. There's tons of new technologies like blockchain that we've heard about that are going to be adding more layers to this question. So what is the relationship between contracting and innovation? And if I were to tee up a question, that might be a good one to start with. And in what ways is contracting helpful to innovation, and in what ways is it harmful? And I'll tee that up and also see if there's other places where we want to start, Lisa.
Okay, Emilie, Kadens, do you want to jump in here?
Do we want to follow up with Emilie's question about innovation? I'd like to pick up on one of her other buckets on reputation.
Sure, we can start with innovation. Would any of our panelists like to comment on that? Yeah, Tim? You need to unmute, Tim.
Yes. Yeah, that has been quite an area of study for us, Emilie, because I think there are many who would say that, of course, traditional contracts are a major constraint on innovation, that if you have onerous, burdensome risk clauses, for example, innovation by its nature is risky because nobody's done it before. So, I think there's a lot of belief that actually trying to embed innovation clauses and provisions within the standard sort of template documents is a mistake. And that if you really want to drive innovation, it is often more effective outside the framework of the basic supply agreement. I could continue well beyond that, but I think that is probably one of the most fundamental findings that we had in terms of the companies that said they were fairly successful at building innovation into their relationships. And clearly, you do need to think about innovation much more in terms of positive incentives, whereas, of course, traditional contracts tend to rely very much on negative incentives for performance.
Tim, if I could just build on that a little bit, and I think our experiences, especially with companies that we have many big companies Kraft would have a very extensive relationship with. So we would be buying perhaps ingredients, a commodity, an ingredient, a specialized service. And so you have already a relationship set up with them. So then to try to do something very innovative with them in a framework that is completely different is very difficult. It's much easier to be with a company that you've never really, you don't have an existing kind of direct material relationship with, to support your point, Tim. And the second point I was going to make related to that is, again, like a company like Kraft, who takes great pride in the technology and history of technology development in food, it's very, very difficult to structure a contract around innovation and exclusivity. Because, you know, we want it, we think what we can create it best, and if we can't, we certainly don't want to share it with anybody else. So that was always very difficult. And maybe Ted and Christine, you can jump in on some examples of that. But the contracts that I was involved with negotiating with respect to that were very, very difficult. Because again, the major factor in that would be R&D, and they would be the key client and the business unit. So
many of the master agreements had a provision in there that said, we expect you to innovate to improve the productivity of this contract and share with us the cost savings each year. And I know one of my clients who was forced to sign agreements like that sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, all right, you know, fine. If we, you know, why should we do anything if we have to give the savings back to the other side? So, you know, a contract with a supplier is not the best way to encourage innovation. Creating a separate agreement for a project, you know, let's say where each side puts an equal amount of money to come up with a new, you know, the new calorie-free ice cream, you know, I'd be all for that.
Yeah, and I think it's similar, you know, my experience as well. I mean, our standard templates, you know, for like our toll manufacturing agreements, they address if there are any, you know, modifications made that, you know, that come out of the relationship, you know, actually Mondelez, very, very one-sided, right? You know, any new ideas or processes that come out of it, you know, Mondelez, you know, has the opportunity to the supplier must come to Mondelez and identify what they are and the new development is, and more or less we potentially would have an opportunity to see if we would, you know, own that idea or new process, but it's touched on in maybe 3 sections. I think when we do major innovation or look to a partner to embark on, like what Ted said, so like your next latest greatest for us would be cracker or cookie, you know, we engage in more robust, you know, contracts from like a JDA perspective, right, and work out, you know, the development and the processes in that, rather than, you know, in our standard procurement contracts, it's only addressed in maybe 3 provisions very lightly. Mm-hmm.
Emilie, do you want to take it to reputation now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about the food industry is that if you have a supplier who does something wrong, in particular, I'm thinking about food adulteration or counterfeiting of food or ingredients, you could be massively exposed, because if that becomes public or people get sick or die, you have a huge crisis management issue on your hands. So I'm curious as to how you ensure in your contracts that your suppliers are not doing things wrong, that they are not providing you with adulterated food or adulterated ingredients, that they are not counterfeiting the ingredients. And then, you know, to what extent is your concern with the crisis management issue that could arise coming into your contracting? And just sort of subsidiarily, how do you back-to-back your contracts on something like this? So you've got your contracts with your suppliers, and then you've got your contracts with say the grocery stores that you're selling to. And are you thinking about these issues of crisis management, of adulteration across that whole chain of contracts? Or is this really something that you deal with separately in your front end and your back end contracts?
Ted, you're sort of our expert on crisis management. At least you do a wonderful job on it in my class every year. Do you want to kick it off?
Well, I think the basic rules of crisis management apply. You get out ahead of it, and you try and take control. Disclose what you know, and be proactive. Most all food processing agreements have some sort of recall provision in there regarding, who's responsible for a recall, if a recall is necessary, or a market withdrawal, which is slightly lower in scope than a recall. But my advice always was, if you suspect anything is wrong, move quickly, get the product out of the market if possible, and that's how you minimize the damage. As long as people remember that it was there and it was gone, that's better than, it was dangling in the wind and the company was denying and not becoming truthful. But of course, that doesn't address the question of how do you prevent that from happening. Obviously, a history, a relationship with a supplier is going to be key, because there are some people that you can rely on and trust that they'll provide you with quality materials. There are some inspections that I think are necessary and not unexpected. When I represented the manufacturers for other manufacturers, there would be an inspection provision in there, and that was fine, because we were all on the same team. We didn't want you to discover any Food and Drug Act problems, but if you did, by God, we wanted to fix them immediately. So you should have that kind of relationship. And while it may be insulting to one company to say we're going to inspect you, it shouldn't be unexpected at all. And that was a key to why we did not want to do business with certain overseas food suppliers who had great prices, great promises of quality, but they wouldn't allow anyone from our company or a third-party inspection firm to take a look at their facilities. So that put us on notice. Unfortunately, there was no serious harm from that.
Christine or Marcia, do you want to jump in on this?
I would just add that, I think it's so embedded in a food company, the quality processes. The industry has written many of the regulations that govern it. Certainly Kraft Foods did, and quality training, the screening for suppliers, new suppliers coming in, to Ted's point, all of those things would go into before suppliers even chosen. I'm not aware of any contracts that would bridge the supply chain, but both the whole supply chain, certainly if there was a recall, acted very, very quickly across the supply chain to identify what needed to be pulled and got it out of there right away. I think that's just was very, I've never seen that not happen, because it is the whole industry, and it is that is affected by it. So that happened very quickly, at least in any time I've seen that operate. So I think, it's always a risk, it's always scary, but food safety was so embedded into everything that everyone did, and the supply base. It was the number one thing to protect. By food safety, it's not just food quality, that was almost a given, but it's other things that can go wrong. Is there a glass, chip in the bottle, or things like that? Those things can happen, but they have to be addressed immediately, to Ted's point, and everybody, it's all hands on deck when that does happen. And that's how you build your trust with your consumer. What else can you do if something goes wrong, right? Build all the processes in place and fix it, and admit it and fix it as fast as you can. So.
Yeah, and I can add that those are very real risks, right? Finding, a piece of plastic in, a bulk bag of, like, for us, it would be, Oreo cookies or Sour Patch Kids. And, what we expect is, if there were an incident, as a food company, you have to quickly figure out the root cause of that issue to be able to respond, for example, to the FDA, and that you've done your investigation. So our expectation of our, whether an ingredient supplier or otherwise, is we would have, full visibility into the process that they have on their end, for us to conduct our root cause analysis. And to also build on what Marcia said before, we have in our quality organization, folks who will almost actually, it's almost to the extent of an audit, the supplier prior to even contract being signed. We haven't, for example, an external manufacturing, process where they get, any company who is looking to partner us, we would, require certain documents, and that's even before there's an established contract, right? Because we're not going to go that far down the line without ensuring their facilities and their processes are up to par to what we need in our standards. And one thing that we've done over the years, I think since we split from Kraft, is we have our supplier portal that's publicly available and house honestly a huge amount of documents in our quality expectations manual, which is a 40-50 page manual. It's a global, and it's globally leveraged across our businesses, to put all that information at the out front, like from HACCP plans to, other types of food safety requirements.
Thank you. I want to turn it over now to Bob and then to Douglas, and then we will take questions from those who have raised their hand and the chat. Bob, over to you.
Great, thank you. This is a terrific day. I'm learning a lot, lots of fun. Douglas, I didn't realize you're a chef. I think I'm here just because I enjoy food, but I'm going to go with with George Triantas's idea of a buffet of questions, 3 quick ones. The first one, I guess, is mostly maybe for Marcia and Christine. So it comes a little bit out of the discussion that Wolfgang and Kate were having last session. So who's good at this, and why are the laggards behind? Do they not know they're behind? Do they not know what to do? Or is there something that's hard to do if you wanted to be really good at this? And in particular, Christine just mentioned, the folks in the quality department, and earlier Marcia mentioned IT and R&D and lots of other parts of the organization beyond procurement. And so my question for Marcia and Christine is, if there's one thing that you'd like to do to change the rest of your organization, some other part of your organization outside procurement, to help with these processes, what's that thing, and is it hard to get done? Why isn't it happening? So that's question 1. Question 2 is more for Ted, and it relates to something that Brad said at the very end of the last session. Ted this time said that a big problem is failure to contemplate changed circumstances. And so Brad said, we just didn't see it coming, but let me, acknowledge, of course, that could happen. But concretely, Ted, what's an example of one shock that, having perhaps not seen it coming or thought that it was very rare, you wish it had been handled differently by your clients, perhaps, in the event? Or, and to look ahead a little bit to tomorrow's discussion by David and Kate and Oliver, do you wish that it had been handled in some more general, the word principles came up earlier today, some more general sense in the negotiation stage? And maybe negotiation is even the wrong word then for that kind of activity. And so the third question is really not really a question, but it's going to turn into things that I'm sure will come up tomorrow. Person after person is mentioning the C word, culture, and I'd be very interested in the role of the culture inside one organization in dealing with these relational contracts between organizations. I'd also be interested in, how do you think about the culture of a relationship? But maybe that third one is leftovers in the buffet for tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, well, with question 1, that was directed to Marcia and Christine. Christine, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. In terms of what would I want to change? I mean, I what I've seen is that we have templates and more templates, from a procurement point of view. Any type of different relationship you can think of, ranging from your standard toll manufacturing to even marketing media agency agreements, and very useful and helpful for our procurement function to use, whether it's an RFP situation or otherwise. That being said, I think it may have been Marcia, you brought it up, like someone who owns the contract, right? And what I find is, you could template as much as you want and make the contract as beautiful as possible, but ideally, you need that cross-functional input to drive that agreement to execution. And I think one of the reasons why the time it takes is the time it takes, and the churn, there's a lot of churn internally, is our procurement leads have to go to each function every time a supplier wants to amend those sections which pertain to their area. So, quality, food safety is a high priority for us. They can, procurement lead can go in and know that those are very hard, to negotiate out on our side. But if we have a very important supplier, that person then needs to go to the quality function, have them weigh in. Then let's just think that any innovation IP aspects of the agreement, then they need to go to the R&D lead or the IP attorney. Similarly, and now that we are as a company are moving more into the data space, every time we have a relationship that there's a potential to take in PII, there has to be a criticality assessment done. And then the, our, what we call our IS function has to weigh in. So the amount of time it takes to get that contract to execution, not even taking into account the negotiations, is extremely long. Ideally, you'd have, a core team who is tasked for procurement in each function that is almost on hand, for every, maybe not every contract, right? But every at least critical large contract for the company. I would even call it a SWAT team, right? And that's how I think could help expedite some of these contracts for us, and potentially even, having more involvement in those discussions, which quality and for example, is not involved in the negotiations. It's just one procurement lead most of the time. So I think having that cross-functional gathering input and is probably a really good idea that I don't think organizationally we're set up to do that.
Marcia, do you want to?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer for you, Bob, but I was interested to hear Wolfgang talk about at P&G, and the same thing happens at Kraft. So to try to expedite decision-making, not just in procurement, from a procurement standpoint, but across all the businesses, there tends to be this swing back and forth between strongly centralized functions and more business unit focus, and business unit having the decision-making authority. So it's a smaller unit, they can make the call. And what does the company do? The company gives up perhaps leveraging sugar or cocoa across the whole business, but at least that division can get a decision made and move the business forward. So I think that's what big companies try to do. And you hear that in the reorganizational structures, or even simply kind of splitting the business apart so it can focus, right? Because of what Christine talked about, it can be so cumbersome in a matrix organization to get approval from everyone, especially if your culture is an approval culture, and that's important too. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about as Lisa and Ted and Christine and I were talking about this panel was, I wish I had something, many years ago, to do an assessment on whether the organization and the supplier, not just the supplier, and whether you should do a transactional contract or a relationship contract, but whether or not your own organization can actually engage in that. So not only is it leadership, but it's the culture of the industry that you're operating. I mean, the glass industry is very different than the ingredient industry. So you can't do the same thing in there, right? Even though they both go into one product. There would be so the technology of that industry, it would be the culture, it'd be geographical. There's certain countries you're not going to be able to do that in, so don't try. And so I think, and I'd be really interested if there's any research been done on assessing that before we even start the relationship, whether it really makes sense, or are there things that you could do to fix that, change that? Are there things in the industry? Can you add capacity? You're always trying to create something that might allow you to do that. So those are two thoughts related to that question. The matrix and how it migrates back and forth, And is there something up front even before this that we can assess whether this is even possible right now? So that would.
Okay,
All right,
Ted, did you
yeah,
want
let me
to?
respond quickly to Bob's question. Sort of two types of changes. One, it was what the lawyers would call a force majeure type of change, where something sudden and unexpected happens. There historically has been a boilerplate force majeure clause stuck in contracts, and rarely, I can't remember ever negotiating that. We would look in there and say, oh yeah, okay, fine. With COVID, we've learned that some of them didn't include the word disease in their force majeure, and they're holding their counterparty to the terms of the contract, notwithstanding COVID. And there's inconsistent litigation on that, and so that is to be determined. But that should be in the contract. The other type of change that I lived through, unfortunately, was where there was an industry change. The economics of a business changed, and people had contracted on the assumption that it was the old way. One example was dozens of small companies who served as dairy products distributors. They'd have one or two trucks, and they'd call on stores in their neighborhood to deliver ice cream or cottage cheese or something like that. Stores became supermarkets. Supermarkets had warehouses. They couldn't serve a warehouse because they didn't have a semi-trailer full of product. And yet they claimed they had a contract, and there were some vagaries about whether it was terminable or we had promised that it would go to their children as well. But neither side contemplated that the economics of the industry would change. And so that's the kind of thing where I don't know how you plan for that, but there has to be a way to deal with that.
Thank you. Douglas, would you like to close it out for the panelists' questions?
Sure. I want to follow up on what Ted said with the following question for Christine and Marcia, which is, what are the sources of failure that you see? We've heard about the possibility there's sudden industry change. We've also heard before about the possibility there's just a bad event that happens, a risk that just happens to manifest itself. Oliver talked about shirking or cheating. Could be there's limited confidence. It could be there's just a culture clash. It's just a bad marriage. What is the source of failure that you see? And in particular, with respect to these sources of failure, how much does ordinary contract law come to rescue in terms either of being able to successfully sue for damages or just exercising your right to terminate the contract because of material breach? In other words, is there a connection between the things that go wrong and what we traditionally think of as the traditional remedies of contract law?
Well, I think if there's a right to terminate on a relatively short term, then that's the solution right there. So in the case that formed my jaundiced view of contracts when I was at a very young age, there was a complete lack of documentation about the agreements, and each side had a different recollection of what was promised. But let's say some other change happens like that, you'll have in all of the contracts that I've worked on, there's some sort of right to terminate, so that even if the underlying assumptions on which both sides develop the contract have changed, it's for a temporary period of time, then eventually it'll be over. So you can't foresee the future in every respect, even if it's sort of a gradual alteration over time. So I think that's less of a problem, and it's less a problem when there's good communications between the parties and they're very clear about their assumptions. We're making this contract on the assumption that we will always need sugar to do something, because we're making cookies and we need sugar for cookies. If that changes, you could build it into the contract and say, if we're going to discontinue making cookies, we'll give you X months notice before terminating the contract. So it comes back to my initial point of better communication, so that parties go into the agreement with a understanding of everyone's interests.
Yeah,
Victor, sorry, go ahead, Marcia.
No, I would have come at it a very similar way in terms of termination of the contract. I mean, obviously did have disputes with suppliers over various things and typically work those out. Because suppliers wanted to continue to supply to Kraft. Often they didn't after that, but we're, you know, the industry is small enough that people understood what was happening in the industry. So the reputation matters a lot.
And also not to emphasize this, but the formal legal contract doesn't, the fact that you had a binding legal contract matters less.
I would say yes, matters less.
Yeah, if you want to get another customer, you know, that word spreads if you know you abuse the relationship. And one other thing I should point out, related to what was said before, one of my clients was a food processor that literally did business with every major food company in the United States. And each one of them had their own supplier quality expectations and a different process on how they to do it. It drove my client nuts because they had to do things differently for each client. And for them, the net result was the same. It was a quality assurance process, but it had to be so different that it required an investment on them just to comply with the contract, not to get it done just because of the steps. So that's one of the weaknesses of these systems where you try to micromanage the process. Admirable goals, but not a good result. And let me say one thing. I just saw a question in the chat about moral considerations about contracting. In my experience, very rare. Okay, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, Victor?
Yeah, I just had a simple question. We talked about innovation before. And the question, I think the harder innovation question is when you have to coordinate the innovation across the two firms. How do you go about doing that?
Anyone want to take that on?
I'm sorry, Victor, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, when you have an innovation that requires the coordination between Kraft and a supplier, how do you manage to do that? Get the two to coordinate and produce the innovation?
Victor, do you have in mind a situation where the innovation requires some input from the employees of Kraft and some from the employees of the supplier, that sort of a thing?
Right. The supplier says, you know, Kraft says, we want a particular type of food to be produced, whatever it is. And a supplier says, well, we think we can do that, but we need to coordinate with you because we don't know exactly how to do this. We don't know what you want. We need scientists from your firm, scientists from our firm, perhaps, or at least marketers. Because there is coordination that has to be done between the two sides. How do you do it? Or don't you ever?
I mean, I know we do it, but we do it in the context of a JDA, you know, where it sets out the roles and responsibilities of each party and which phase of development. You know, I'm working on a relationship right now where, you know, we are working with innovation that we are going to be coming out with, and we are working with an ingredient supplier partner. And, you know, collaborate very closely, you know, with our, regulatory and R&D functions very collaboratively, you know, it's almost to the extent it feels like more of just, you know, it's more of a strategic partnership is what it ends up being rather than a plain vanilla supplier manufacturer relationship. And just an interesting aspect of this one, obviously can't disclose details, but you know, we also the relationship started out as I just described, and then as you know, the two companies talked more, they realized there were some benefits also where we could be the ingredient supplier for that partner for their business. And from a contracting standpoint, we ended up executing that contract first, where Mondelez was an ingredient supplier for them, you know, with a license agreement as well. You know, we license out our brands to them. And what we agreed in the negotiation of that was that when it came time to enter into the agreements for Mondelez to produce their product, again, turning the tables around, they provide us the ingredient. We were going to be basically using the same exact templates, just turning them around. Wow. So interestingly, we, as the ingredient supplier for them, had to agree to their quality expectations manual. Not exactly in line with ours, but we had our quality folks revise it, we negotiated it. And now we're going to be using that same exact manual, which is theirs, and turning it around and using it on them, for this next relationship. It's very unique. Actually, I don't think we've done this before, but it's interesting because when we were negotiating the quality expectation manuals as an ingredient supplier for them, it was their manual. We had to have our Mondelez quality folks come in and they weren't really happy about, the situation, but it was for the greater good of the business, right? Some of the concessions we had to make. And then what gave them comfort was that in the next, for us, when it came to us in our products, we would actually have those same requirements, right? So the tables are turned. So if they're getting something really good on this one, we're going to get it on the other end, right? Whether it be access to their, facilities, audit requirements. So I just wanted to bring that up as a bit of a unique situation, actually, and one that everyone is internally a little bit uncomfortable with, but one that we are moving forward with.
Okay, our next questioner is Nick.
Okay, I'm going to ask kind of a long-winded question, but I think it's really yes or no. Maybe the only yes or no question you'll get. And it harkens back to what we were talking about earlier, internal management of supplier relationships. So it's for Christine and Marcia. Do Kraft and Mondelez face this problem? You have standard templates, maybe you have some standard scorecards you use, but yet you'd like to treat different suppliers differently. Maybe if one messes up, you'd like to punish them harshly. Maybe if another one messes up to the same extent, you might like to punish them less harshly. Is that a problem, number one? And number two, is it a problem that there may be different people within your organization who want to punish harder or punish less hard, people in the different functions? I think those are two yes or no questions.
Oh,
Problem or not?
Yes or no questions, Nick, but I'd love to hear your response. Should we start with you, Marcia?
Okay, the first question was, because you were breaking up a little bit, Nick, so I'm sorry. The first question was?
This question was, you're using standardized templates and scorecards, but you might like to punish different suppliers differently, even if they do this about the same transgression. Is that a problem in differential treatment of suppliers, but using some of the same evaluation metrics?
Well,
And
you have
second,
different contracts, so you have different mechanisms, right? Even if you have the same scorecards.
Okay, and how about the problem of internal agreement about the harshness of punishment?
Well, that comes back to who's the final decision maker, right? So in my thinking, so is procurement the decision maker? That's possible. Is the business unit the responsible decision maker? Do they decide? And depending on the function, that can change.
So do you find it to be a problem, or is that something easily managed?
No, it's not a problem.
Yeah, and just to build on that last comment, I mean, I think my experience, I don't see much internal misalignment on how to deal with partners, but there have been instances where we have had issues with a partner, and the business, I'll just give you more, for one of our products, the business gets very upset. Something was, and not a quality issue. It could be even, we have even run into issues where we have, we allegedly think folks at our external manufacturing are releasing some of our innovation without, before it should be. So in those cases, right, you have a business that is trying to keep a big launch confidential. We have to rely on external manufacturer. Their employees are allegedly leaking that innovation. And so you have the business leadership very upset, but you have the procurement, function who that relationship, is very critical. It's critical to the business too, right? They're producing our products. But ultimately what ends up happening is there is a solution, right? Solution because we need that partner to run our business. And, typically the lawyers have to come in and lawyer to lawyer talks to figure out, how it can be addressed. So we, can prove back to, honestly to the business that we're trying to find a solution and it's not going to blow up, right? Because at the end of the day, no one wants it to blow up. Even if there was some, wrongdoing, on the part of the supplier.
Okay, well, since we only have a few more minutes, I wanted to ask Amit and then Emilie to ask their questions, because I think they will take us together in a very different direction. I think it would be sort of nice to conclude by looking at something that's quite different. So I'll turn it over first to you, Amit.
Great, thanks, Lisa, and fascinating event. I have two questions. The first one is more of a broader issue that I think hasn't come across, we haven't discussed yet, is about consumer awareness. So as consumer awareness is on the rise and the consciousness of consumers is being elevated, how are those discussions trickling down with the discussions with suppliers and the contracts that you have with suppliers? And my second question is more to Marcia, having grown up on Kraft products in East Africa. My question is, when you introduced yourself, you mentioned taking practices from North America to sort of the global space. And I was wondering, what are the sort of key challenges and lessons that are difficult to execute in emerging markets? And you have this philosophy of plan, buy, deliver. I was wondering how that gets injured when you go to an emerging market. If you can share any lessons on that. Thank you.
Emilie, do you want to put yours out on the table too?
Yes, great. So a lot of times you might want to drive change in your suppliers. And I'm thinking especially about social and environmental practices. So maybe you want, a farm to use more sustainable practices, or you want a packager to use recycled product, or, a cocoa farm to use better labor practices or something. So how do you drive that change in your suppliers, and what role do contracts play in that? And does that vary domestically and overseas and by the bargaining power of that? So I imagine it's very different to ask Georgia Pacific to give you recycled paper than to ask a tiny cocoa farm to improve its labor practices. So I'm curious about the role of contracting in driving change in existing suppliers.
Christine, do you want, whoever
Yeah,
wants
let me, again, I think Kraft's had a long experience, and it's one of the reasons why having real expertise, incredible expertise, like world renowned in some of these commodity areas, is so critical. So, and I use cashews. Cashews is the best example for the planters business for many years. I mean, again, when prices are high for cashews, the people that pick them just go deeper into the jungle. And so you need to have a very, very strong supply network and relationships with the people who are harvesting and assembling cashews. Same is true in cocoa, obviously, and many other commodities that Kraft has bought for years in many parts of the world. So that's critical. And many aspects of those have for a long time been built into contracts, and those expectations and those audits and visiting farms, visiting suppliers for years has occurred. So that's nothing new. It's one of the keys, not only for kind of the social responsibility aspect, but the quality of the product that's being acquired as well. So those things have been there. And I think, again, and I'm sure this is still true, long history of kind of social responsibility and fair trade supply chains. Now, there's also price considerations with respect to that. So those are also business decisions. They're not only supply chain decisions. Many of those factors have a different price level. So that's part of a broader business decision discussion that has to occur. So, and those have occurred for years. With respect to emerging markets, and again, I think there's lots of interesting challenges and different unique products as well. I think the way that has been managed the best is that when local businesses run those markets, because they know them the best, they often know the suppliers. And when the big global entity can provide some leverage or someone could share into a sugar contract or a packaging contract from somewhere, that could help that local business. But those local businesses would tend to be run because they know that business best.
Anyone else from the panel want to speak to this?
I could just make just one quick point. I mean, I think as many public companies and large companies, we are really focused right now on, on driving change, whether it's sustainability or, supplier diversity, economic inclusion. Those are some of the 3 pillars I think that our procurement organization is now really focused on. And we have been, not just now, I think over the years as well. We have some of the things like you mentioned, like a Cocoa Life program. We even have a palm oil action plan that we require our suppliers to follow. And what's interesting about it, it's all on our available publicly. And actually, interestingly, when I was just looking at a lot of our information before this panel, there's even we even have what we call like a palm oil grievance process, where if there are grievances raised to us, there's a process where we need to go to the supplier and how do we address, like what they need to do, information they need to provide to us. So it's been part of, I think, our company for a while, but I think it's a bit more in the forefront now, and one that we're probably going to continue focusing on and requiring our suppliers to meet certain expectations in these areas. Because of the areas that we, because we are, heavily involved in procuring things like cocoa and palm oil and other ingredients in areas that these issues are actually really prevalent for. And the other thing is just supplier diversity. I think that's something that's has always been a focus, but I think even more so. So we're going to be looking at different types of suppliers, right? Maybe not always the largest global ones, maybe the smaller ones that are, run, from a more diverse perspective. So that's I think one of our, KPIs now for our organization.
Yeah, Tim. Tim, we can't hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry. If I could just build on that a little, I think completely agree with Christine there. I think we see 2 converging trends from a lot of the research we do. One, absolutely the whole sort of ESG direction, supplier diversity, inclusion, etc., which has a very real impact, I suppose, on some of the values that organizations need to espouse, need to visibly espouse, and where, of course, they then become much more welcoming of a more diverse supply community. But having said that, there's always been, of course, an innate cost to that. I mean, just how many, the trend in procurement, of course, has been to try to reduce the number of direct suppliers and to drive towards consolidation. And there, I think we get the other interesting converging feature, which is the enablement of new technologies. And certainly, the food industry, I suppose, is a classic example of where the introduction of new technologies is potentially enabling much greater visibility and transparency across the supply chain. But of course, it's also enabling big suppliers like Kraft, for example. Certainly, a lot of the conversation we've been having with companies like AB InBev as an example too, where they can really begin to drive value through technologies right down low levels of supply chain. So providing quality, not only quality monitoring, but direct quality advice to farmers and etc. So I think there's a really exciting shift there. And I think a lot of the consequence of that, and what comes back actually to our relational topic, is it starts to create the ability to stop thinking so much about supply chains, which by their nature tended to be, well, I've got a tier 1 supplier, they then contract with people who contract with people, and my visibility diminishes with each step. And we're beginning to look and think much more about the opportunities for the management of supply networks and supply ecosystems, which I think becomes fascinating in the relational contracting context. if I may, just a final point very quickly, I'd also love to pick up on a point that Christina made too, about this question of who owns the contract, which of course is an endemic issue, and certainly in my many years involved with contracting in every corporation, that's been a big question. But again, I think that may be the wrong question. At a transactional level, I think what we've been depicting here is absolutely right. It is a relational activity. It's bringing together a whole group of functional stakeholders. And of course, our secret is to try and create an environment of creative contention rather than destructive contention. But once again, I think with the emergence of better technology, we're also beginning to see perhaps a different question emerging, which is not who owns the contract at a transactional operational level, but actually who owns the contracting process and has responsibility for driving efficiency and integrity into the process to enable the performance of all of those stakeholders. And, we're actually about to issue a report on exactly that topic, because that's where we see the leading corporations making that distinction between the owner of individual contracts and the owner of contracting capability.
Well, thank you, Tim. And since we're out of time, I just want to close things out by going back to where Aguirre began this morning, when he described meeting the head of the Chinese vaccine company or pharmaceutical company, and after one dinner coming to the conclusion that he could be trusted. And in that spirit, I want to thank Ted, Tim, Brad, Rupert, and Sally, all people who I met at various different times and learned very quickly I could trust, and to whom I outsourced choosing our industry panelists with virtually no oversight or monitoring. And I think everyone came through splendidly, so that we can all give a cheer for relationalism and the use of trust. And anyone who wants to stay around and talk further is welcome. I also want to note that our industry participants from the panels, anyone who wants to nip in tomorrow and bring a little bit of realism to a conversation that, might have a tendency to go up the ivory tower at times, we would for sure welcome your presence and your comments. So I'll close it out there with thanks to everyone, and anyone who wants to stay around and talk is welcome to do so. If there's anybody watching from the WCC side on the pharmaceutical industry who would be willing to be interviewed, please reach out to me. I'm starting a study on the industry and love to talk to as many of you as possible. So thank you again, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow.